Welcome, everyone. Let's jump right into this explainer. I'll be acting as your lead risk analyst today because, frankly, we're looking at an absolutely unprecedented dual crisis that is literally choking our global supply lines. We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to hit the ground running with a bottom-line up-front assessment of what's happening in the Middle East and, more importantly, what it means for your enterprise.
Now this number right here, this is the immediate shockwave. In early 2026, peak Brent crude hit $126 a barrel. I mean, that is just a staggering shock to the global energy system, all driven by a sudden severe military escalation in the Persian Gulf.
And the reason prices skyrocketed like that? The disruption actually represents a loss of up to 13 million barrels per day. The International Energy Agency isn't mincing words here, guys. They're officially calling this the largest energy security threat in history. Let that sink in.
So how do we get here? Well, it all started with a massive, immediate 70% drop in tanker traffic right through the Strait of Hormuz. We saw over 150 ships just suddenly drop anchor outside the strait to avoid the escalating risks. They effectively paralyzed the world's most critical maritime trade corridor practically overnight.
All right, looking at our agenda, we're going to breeze through a threat briefing overview. We'll look at the physical dual blockade, the resulting energy shocks, cyber threats to critical infrastructure, the tech versus energy market split, alternative ports, and wrap it all up with an executive mitigation checklist. Let's get into it.
Moving into Section 1, the physical dual blockade. We're looking at a tale of two competing choke points here. The reality on the water is a massive asymmetric standoff between the U.S. Navy and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Take a look at how this dual blockade breaks down into two totally competing strategies. It's a fascinating look at the operational realities on the ground. Iran's strategy is all about asymmetric denial. They're using drones, GPS spoofing, sea mines, and exacting tolls of over $1 million per ship just right there, regionally at the strait. But on the flip side, the United States has launched a massive global enforcement campaign. They're actively intercepting vessels and deploying secondary sanctions way beyond the Gulf, stretching all the way into the Indian and Pacific Oceans.
All right, on to Section 2, energy shocks and global logistics. This is the industrial pricing cascade. Because, as you know, this maritime paralysis doesn't just stay at sea, right? It directly triggers violent energy shocks and massive global logistics failures that are hitting heavy industry hard.
It is absolutely crucial to understand that we aren't just talking about oil here. The disruption is severely impacting critical supply chains totally across the board. For instance, roughly 30% of global ammonia plus massive amounts of sulfur and raw aluminum are just completely disrupted. Urea prices? They jumped a massive 50% since the conflict started, and global helium supplies are taking a huge hit because Qatari natural gas production got interrupted. This is fundamentally upending global supply chains for heavy industry and agriculture. It's a real domino effect.
And the financial friction of all this is just staggering. Even during brief windows when political leaders claim the strait is technically open, commercial reality paints a very different picture. War risk insurance rates have surged 4 to 6 times. That's $250,000 in added cost just to move a single very large crude carrier through the strait. Commercial liabilities making passage practically impossible for most fleets out there.
Okay, Section 3, cyber threats to critical infrastructure, or what we're calling the vanishing digital perimeter. Let's look at how this physical threat is bleeding over into the digital realm, specifically with state-linked targeting of critical infrastructure.
This is exactly where state-sponsored hacking and geopolitical instability collide. Look at how rapidly these threat actors progressed. Back in February, they started quietly breaching perimeter networks using vulnerabilities in Cisco Edge devices via the Firestarter backdoor. But then, notice the shift in mid to late March. Threat groups like the Iran Nexus Cyber Avengers pivoted aggressively toward industrial operational technology, or OT. They specifically targeted Rockwell Automation's FactoryTalk software. The goal here went from simple data theft to attempting real, physical, destructive disruption of critical infrastructure. It's a totally different ballgame now.
Moving on to Section 4, tech equities versus energy inflation. How do we navigate these diverging markets? Well, we need to see how this dual physical and cyber threat is impacting the macro picture, contrasting surreal market resilience with actual inflationary pressures.
So the key takeaway here is this crazy split-screen economy you've got to navigate. On one hand, we have the total euphoria of the AI innovation rally. This is being driven by blowout 20% earnings from companies like Intel, robust agentic AI growth, and just massive data center capital expenditures. But that completely masks heavy industry drag caused by energy inflation. We're plagued by surging transport costs and that 50% jump in urea prices we talked about. We really have to balance this incredible technological growth with the rising geopolitical operational risks that are driving up transport and procurement costs all over the world.
Which brings us to Section 5, Geopolitics, Sanctions, and Alternative Ports. We're essentially looking at redrawing the supply chain map here, moving way beyond traditional choke point.
Now, to understand these contested waters, you absolutely have to understand the shadow fleet. This is a massive, incredibly complex network of vessels. They are actively using obscured tracking signals, doing mid-ocean ship-to-ship transfers, and hiding behind highly opaque corporate ownership structures. Why? To completely bypass global sanctions and keep contested energy flowing under the radar.
And because of these blockades, the strategic importance of certain ports is radically shifting. For example, Iran is adapting by utilizing the Chabahar port in the Gulf of Oman. By setting up alternative export routes that entirely bypass the Strait of Hormuz, they're actively challenging existing U.S. naval blockade strategies. They're basically redrawing long-term global trade patterns right before our eyes.
Meanwhile, the U.S. enforcement campaign is going global and directly tangling up U.S. and Chinese economic alignments. The U.S. is imposing sweeping sanctions on major entities like China-based Hengli Petrochemical, along with 40 different shipping firms tied to that shadow fleet we just discussed. It's a perfect example of how geopolitical enforcement is directly dictating global energy trade stability right now.
Finally, Section 6, our Executive Risk Mitigation Checklist. This is an actionable strategy for permanent volatility, and for those of you managing enterprise risk, this is really where the rubber meets the road.
Your compliance teams need to implement these steps immediately. First up, you have to manage cargo provenance. That means heavily auditing the beneficial ownership of every single shipping partner and cross-referencing their flag state exposure against global enforcement lists to avoid secondary sanctions. Simultaneously, you've got to secure that digital perimeter. Get those vulnerable Cisco routers patched right away and implement continuous, aggressive monitoring for your operational technology networks. You cannot ignore the OT side.
Here is your bottom line checklist for logistics and procurement. First, divest from high-risk shipping insurers operating in contested waters. Second, audit your ICS and OT software dependencies, specifically Rockwell Automation, since we know state actors are actively targeting it. Third, you need to budget for sustained baseline oil prices exceeding $100 a barrel. Next, you absolutely must diversify your heavy industry suppliers for things like aluminum and fertilizer completely outside the Gulf region. And lastly, review and update your network vulnerability response times for edge devices. Time is of the essence when a breach happens.
I'll leave you with this final thought to challenge your boardroom strategy. We are no longer dealing with temporary disruptions. As physical maritime choke points close and our digital perimeters literally vanish under state-sponsored cyber attacks, you have to ask yourself, is your enterprise truly engineered for an era of permanent volatility? It's time to build resilience into the very DNA of your operations. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing and keep adapting.